Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of summer seminar. My name is Joyce Kwok from the First Academy. I'm one of the co-chairs for this program. Thank you guys for joining early in the summer. I know that some of you guys are in a different time zone, and so we're really thankful for you guys joining us. Just as a reminder, SACAC is an amazing program. A SACAC Summer Seminar is an amazing program for those of you who are starting in this field of working with high school students and guiding them along in their high school career and on. We have 6 of us who worked hard to put this together for you guys. Usually it's on a college campus for about 4 days. And we get to have a lot of fun together. But we're actually very grateful that we get to do this at least on Zoom, getting to know you guys. And you'll know that all of our contact info is in the presentation, which will be sent out later on so that you guys can feel free to reach out to us. And we're here to answer any questions and things like that. Today we have 2 sessions. The first one will be recommendation writing. The second session will be on special talents in athletics and admissions. And we'll have time for Q&A. And so in the chat box, feel free to put all of your questions there, and we will do our due diligence in answering all of your questions. And if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure we're actually spending some time as a team to answer every question that's been listed in the chat, and we'll be sending all of those out as well. At this time, we're going to do a quick intro of our co-chairs and faculty members. We have John Hawkins, Director of College Advising at Lausanne Collegiate School. He's our supporter, the best encourager of our team. He loves his students, and he's a huge part of this program. There's myself, Joyce Kwok. I'm the Director of College Guidance at the First Academy in Orlando. Kate Massey, Senior Associate Director of Admissions at Loyola University, New Orleans. She's actually worked in the high school side as well, and now I'm serving at her institution. Dan Monahan, he's one of our co-chairs as well, Director of College Counseling at St. Andrew's Sewanee School. Don't be fooled by his size. He's actually the biggest softie you'll ever meet. He's known as Coach Dan, but I call him Dan the Man because he can do everything. There's our Freddie Glitman, our Associate Director of Admission at Lynn University. And Freddie is one of those who will bend over backwards for any student, any colleague. And our Bev Brooks, Director of Academics and College Counseling at YSC Academy. She's actually my go-to for any quirky situations I have with athletes. She has an answer for me every time. And so you'll find great information through Bev Brooks. All right, and so at this time, we're actually gonna roll right into, actually, before we get started with the first session, we wanted to do a group photo with everyone who's here today. And so if you're comfortable with turning on your camera, we would ask that you turn it on, and Dan's gonna take a quick photo so that we could put this on social media for SACAC. Dan, will you let us know when you're taking the photo? Your mic's off.
All right, everybody smile now, and then and hold it. There we go. That's not a great one. Let me take another one. Let's hold on to that. I'm just taking a bunch. You know, it's like taking a burst at a family reunion. One's got to turn out nice. I think we're good.
All right. Thank you to our resident photographer, Dan the Man. And we're going to go ahead and get started.
And then, so we'll go right into it. First slide, you, Joyce.
All right. With our recommendation letters, most of you guys have heard of this important piece in the admissions process. And for all of you guys who will be working with seniors and colleges that require this, just keep in mind that it's not, some colleges will require the recommendation letter, but some will not. And so it's not a complete black and white process where every college requires a recommendation letter, but it is going to be something that you find out along with the students and seeing that only some require this piece. Counselor and teacher recommendations are a huge part of the admissions requirement. They give substantial weight in giving a picture of the student, and the deadlines are specific to each college and university. It could be submitted according to the application deadline, or it could be later. Again, every institution is very different in when they require this and their deadlines. It's important that you guys create a specific process in how you want to process recommendation letters with your students. So for example, I work with a group of about 90 seniors, and it's very easy for students to start requesting for letters months and months before, or sometimes day before the deadline. And so you want to do what's best for you as you serve your students. And so create a system where you do require a specific deadline for you and your office in producing these letters, and a process for them requesting it as well. And Dan's going to talk about kind of like the different types of recommendations that we have all experienced with in terms of narrative, bulleted narrative, and possibly we'll mention information about the forms that you will probably engage with this coming fall.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the format that I use. It's a lot of my recommendation writing is formed from my years in college admission. Reading thousands of letters of recommendation, reading really great ones, and reading really bad ones, and learning how to write. When I first moved into college counseling, my gut instinct was to write, a bulleted letter, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But when I came into college counseling, I came into a co-directorship. The person that I was replacing, the school that I started working for, Cheshire Academy in Cheshire, Connecticut, I think did a really smart thing in transitioning a brand new college counselor from the admissions world in a one-year co-director position with the outgoing director. She announced her retirement, and they hired me as the director in waiting. She was adamant that I write a narrative letter. And because that's the way she had always done it for her 35 plus years in college counseling. There's nothing wrong with a narrative letter. I don't want to say that there is. Many people on this call write narrative letters, and that's okay. But for me, it takes a lot of time to write a 1 to 2 page letter. And I know that the admissions world really wants brevity and be able to read and see what they can in a short amount of time. I said this to Joyce last week when we were reviewing this presentation. The kicker for me was when I had a meeting with Deb Johns from Yale University, and she said, we spend 10 to 15 minutes on a file. So if we can read it in 10 to 15 minutes, great. And I said, all right, that's where I'm going to write this letter format that I'm doing. I want to, I know that the admissions offices are going to be inundated. And this year in particular, I think with the test optional movement that we've seen, and hopefully it becomes permanent, applications, and we know the demographics, we know the population is smaller, but we know applications are going to increase. Applications have increased every year for the last decade, despite the population going down. And so it is getting harder, and it's going to be even, we talked about it yesterday, how the letter of recommendation will carry more weight. Somebody asked the question, And I really do think the letter of recommendations can carry more weight. And so if you have the ability to write your recommendations, if your caseload allows you to do so, I absolutely, recommend that you're writing these letters for your students. The reality is I'm a one counselor workshop, one counselor office. I am the college counseling office at St. Andrews Sewanee. And so I'm doing college counseling for all 4 years of our high school, 9 to 12. I'm working with, I guess technically you could say I'm working with 200 students, but I really only look at it as my caseload of my seniors. And looking at my letters of recommendation, I try to write my letters over the summer. I've written about half of my seniors so far for this year. I've got 31 rising seniors plus 3 new seniors coming in this year. So I have 34 seniors this year, which is really a small caseload. Again, I'm blessed. I'm not complaining about that number in any way. But that allows me to write my recommendations over the summer so that I can handle the day-to-day and the one-on-one meetings with them in the fall. Joyce mentioned teacher recs on her first slide, and I'll just give you my timeline. I meet with students in April and require them to meet with teachers in their junior year, and by May 1, give me a signed contract agreeing to write letters of recommendations, both the teacher and the student. And the teachers are given a deadline of October 1st to give me their letters of recommendation. All students, regardless of what their college plans are, at my school are required to get 2 teacher recommendations. So each student, regardless of where they're applying, even if they ultimately apply to a community college or a school that doesn't require letters of recommendation anyway, every student will have 3 letters of recommendation, 2 teachers and the council recommendation, which I'm writing. So that's kind of my background on why I do this. And then I'm gonna spend some time talking about the narrative format that I write, or the bulleted narrative format that I write. If I were to take my bulleted letters, and I'll show you, I know it's hard to see. You're gonna get this presentation. If you guys blow it up, and this is the basic template of, I will maybe blow this up a little bit. Recommendation, design whatever works for you. If you have your school letterhead, obviously use that. The student name, their date of birth. I usually use their date of birth because that's not necessarily public information, but it's not as private as a social security number. So I never obviously put a social security number. First section of the letter, I talk about the distinctive qualities of the student. And this is where I get personal about the student. The personal stories, Freddie said yesterday, write a personal story, tell a story about that kid, and I'm going to remember that student. Talking about the things that separate them from the rest of the class, that separate them from the other students that you've worked with in years past. And this is really, that paragraph or 2 should be really distinct and unique to each student that you write. That's the part that takes me the longest to write for each student, and it really doesn't take that long. I can write these letters in about an hour, at least my rough draft of them, and then I can move on. And the best thing about this, especially as a one counselor office, is I can start multiple letters and I can jump in and out of them because I'm not writing that full narrative where I need silence. I need my kids to leave me alone. I need my dogs to leave me alone. I can write 2 bullets, and Jimmy, my 11-year-old, needs me to go do something. I can go do that. Or I get called into a meeting, which, as we all know, meetings are the bane of our existence. So that opening distinctive qualities paragraph, great start. You want to pull your college reader in, the admission reader in. You want them to fall in love with that kid right away. Next section, academic or intellectual growth or trends. This is putting the student in context academically. You'll see Roland Hall in that example. This presentation is in this format directly, Michelle Rasich, the director of college counseling at Rowland Hall. She's the first person that presented this to me. I saw this at an Access conference a few years ago, and this is like that was the light bulb moment between her presentation and my conversation with Deb Johns. I've never written a narrative letter again, and I won't. So those intellectual bullets, you can use as many or as few as you need. Just like design, like that rule of three. I want to use at least 3 in there, but I don't want to have 18 either. I think the biggest misconception when you tell people you write a bulleted letter, I think they automatically think I'm going to write a bulleted letter and that means 1 or 2 words per bullet. That's not it. You are writing complete sentences. You are putting that student in context, but you are not writing that full paragraph. If I were to take these bulleted letters that I write and write it and take each of those bullets, turn it into a full paragraph with all the connecting beautiful prose and everything else, these are 2 to 3 page letters. But because I'm doing that bulleted format, it gets condensed into where they are. So the academic intellectual growth part, that is really probably the most important. That's the meat of the letter. Again, especially because of the test optional movement this year, we always have known, anybody who's ever worked in college admissions, college counseling knows, the high school transcript is the most important aspect of the college application and the admission application. And we have the awesome power to put all of that in context within this letter. And to say that 4.0 for one student is different than the 4.0 for another student, and why a 3.6 for one student is better than that 4.0 for another student, because of the rigor that they've taken, because of the university classes they've taken, or the AP courses or IB courses, whatever curriculum your school offers, but put that student in context within your school community. Not every kid can be the best one you've ever seen. You know that. We all know that. So you need to choose those words wisely. Areas of impact, the next section of bullets. Here I'm talking about athletics, afternoon programs, extracurriculars, community service, church service, leadership, all the other intangibles that the student might mention in a quick bullet in the admission section of their application on the Common App. They've only got 10 spots on the Common App now to say what they do outside the classroom. I personally like to see more, but it is what it is. And so again, my letter gets to highlight those things. We have, as a residential boarding school, we have a program called the Proctor program. A lot of boarding schools either have proctors, prefects, RAs, things like that. It is a highly selective process. We choose, and the number varies each year. In order to become a proctor, they have to have a clean academic record, they need to have a clean disciplinary record, and they need to have leadership positions before they become a proctor. I talk about the proctor on their letter of recommendation. On their Common App, they get to say they're a proctor, and that's pretty much it, because there's not enough space. And so that's why I want to spend that bullet explaining what the proctorship is and why it is important and why it's a great thing that our kids are proctors. Student self-reflection as a closing. Now, I give each year, I have the students do a junior year questionnaire, answering all the questions that I want. I build my letter of recommendation off of that questionnaire. And I'll send you, with the materials that you'll get a sample of my questionnaire as well. If I get a great quote from the student in the questionnaire, the last question I ask them is, imagine the admission officer reading your letter of recommendation. What do you want to tell them that they haven't already read in your application? What do they need to know about you? And some of my students, we all work with high school students, whether we're new to this or not, we know. Some kids are gonna write a great answer, and I'm 100% gonna copy and paste it right into this letter. And some will give me nothing to go on. And in that case, I'm not gonna even use the student quote. if I have a great student quote, I'm going to use it. If not, I'm just going to close my letter and I'm going to give my final recommendation. In my years of college admissions experience, I can't stress enough, both in your letters of recommendation and your teacher recommendations, the teacher, they need to say in some way or another, and you need to say in some way or another that you recommend this student, that it is, you are giving your recommendation, whether it's your highest recommendation or you're just giving them your recommendation, but you need to use those words in some format. When you just close it and you don't say anything, you're not saying you recommend that student or not, and you don't want to open up anything for interpretation. You don't want the admission office to say, well, geez, did Dan really, he wrote this letter, but he never said he recommended the kids, so how do we read that? And so you want to make sure that you are following that and that you are answering those questions. I'm going back to the wrong presentation. So that's the template. I have two samples here. I'll just go through them quickly of what they look like. You see, I have the word count on there. It doesn't really matter whether it's a great student or an average student. The word count's about the same. The average student and even the great student, we're going to follow the words of Aaron Burr to Alexander Hamilton: talk less and smile more. We want to make sure, and that's the whole point of this bulleted letter, is that we are doing everything we can to give the council, the admission representatives, the information they need to make a positive decision on our student. But we also don't want to kill ourselves spending days writing letters of recommendation that we know are ultimately going to be read in 10 to 15 minutes, along with every other piece of material that's submitted to that college. Again, hard to read, I realize, on the screen, depending on if you're working on a laptop or iPad or if you're on a phone, but you'll get all this. You'll see pretty big opening paragraph about the student, academic information. I've got 4 bullets. I've got 4 bullets on areas of impact. One of my favorite lines: one page doesn't do blank student justice. Yeah, I'm going to reuse that line a couple times throughout several of my letters, at least. But my last line: I enthusiastically and without any reservation recommend Jane Doe to your institution. I'm going to use enthusiastic, and the schools that get a lot of my letters and a lot of my students know that I enthusiastically recommend them. I strongly recommend them. I recommend them, and I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head. I pretty much say I wish them best of luck. You know, there's not. We have to be honest. Not every single one of our kids is college material. Not every single one of our kids is going to go to the schools that they want to go to. The average student, again, you'll see opening paragraph still about the same. Academic section, areas of impact, about 3 letters. And then recommendation at the end. So you see that there's not much variation between a kid that you love and a kid that you're like, all right, he's good, go ahead and take him. So that's my narrative letter. There's a lot of information there. I realize that. We'll get to your questions certainly as we go on, and then I'm going to turn it over to Joyce now for the next slide.
All right. So some of the do's and don'ts of recommendation letters, they're not in any, it's not in any order of important, like specific importance, but obviously they're all important. So for the do's, give examples, be specific in your letters. And we encourage you guys to keep it to 1 page if possible. Unless you're writing a fabulous piece that's 2 pages long. But for the general population, 1 page recommendation letter should still go a long way. proofread. And this is something that I encourage everybody to do, even for our teachers, as they handle recommendation writing. Tell growth of the student, where they started and who they are now, giving a good picture of who they are as an individual in terms of their character and things like that. Mention your caseload, your situation, the school that you're in, amount of time you've spent at your school. I think that develops a clear picture of your relationship with the student as well, and how well you know them. And address anything different from the transcript that's not explained elsewhere. Sometimes I think teachers and advisors and college counselors, it's easy for people to mention like the GPA of the student, things that you already see on a transcript, the number of X amount of classes a student has taken and things like that. But you want to tell a different story than what's already seen on a transcript. Do tell of any unusual circumstances that could have affected their academic performance. And honestly, you know, with learning disabilities or something traumatic a student has gone through, I would say use your best judgment in sharing. It really depends on the specific case. I personally had a student 2 years ago who had severe learning disabilities, but he worked hard, and he pulled through, worked hard for 4 years. And I got to share about that in his applications, and he got into all 8 universities that he applied to. And so, and I think the letter, along obviously with the other pieces of his application, played a huge role in giving the best picture to the admissions folks. So in terms of the don'ts, don't list students' extracurricular activities, their academic accomplishments. Don't list all of their honor rolls, whether they're a member of the National Honor Society, because all of that's going to be included in the student portion of their application. Don't underestimate how much your letter can impact college admissions. It does weigh, if a college is requiring this item, this piece in their admissions process, it's going to hold weight. So don't underestimate your letter. Don't be vague. And we're going to kind of go through some sample recommendation letters, kind of addressing some of these points. And don't share your recommendation letter with the students. And it really depends on what policy you guys have set in place as a school. And it's something probably you might want to work through as you work in your college advising offices and whatnot. But for us at the First Academy, we do not share our recommendation letters with the students. And I've heard wild stories of what can happen. And we can talk about that during our Q&A, but you don't want to share, you want to keep it as confidential as possible. It's really between the recommender and the institution. In terms of like, as part of the dues as well, I think we mentioned this earlier, and Dan mentioned what he does with his juniors and the questionnaire, but get creative. There's really no right or wrong with how you get students to request for these recommendation letters. You can use Google form, paper forms, do a personal interview, but I think spending as much time as possible with the juniors, or even in the beginning of their senior year, will better assist you in writing the best recommendation letter possible for those students. And obviously set deadlines with the students. Again, some will ask day before it's due, and I still get a handful of students who will do that. So get ahead of them and give them a set deadline, and have them follow through with the different procedures you have in place. So the next slide is actually the sample of good versus bad letters. And this was actually posted on MIT's admission site, and it's pretty fun. Again, the fonts may be too small. We'll share the presentation with you guys, so you'll have full access to this. But I'm going to read snippets of the 3 different recommendation letters that's on here, and we're going to kind of dissect this together. Um, the first one is about David. And the letter says, it's a great pleasure for me to recommend David for admission to MIT. He's one of the most extraordinary students I've encountered in 20 years of teaching. I taught David AP Calculus last year as a 10th grader. He was one of the very top students in an extremely able group of mostly seniors. David's abiding interest, however, is computer science. He has developed series of strands for use in providing computerized drill and review of basic skills, techniques. It goes on to talking about how he's worked with 10th graders for 2 weeks and introducing them to computer programming. And he lives in rural Arkansas, and he obviously loves computer programming and working with students. And his personal qualities are as impressive as his intellectual accomplishments. An extremely kind, sensitive, and sensible boy. He has had a difficult family situation for a few years now, and it goes on to talking about the emotional support he has been to his mother who's battling cancer. And this letter, when you read through it, it's very clear that the recommender knows David very well. There's a very clear sense of his intellectual capacities. There's emotional maturity as well, his love for computer programming. And in the midst of the hardship and kind of a difficult family situation he's in, he's still kind of expanding his academic opportunities by providing the computer courses to 10th graders. So this letter is a great letter, and that's just a snippet of it. And our second applicant here is Jen. And this was one of the teacher recommendations about Jen. Jen was a student in one of my predominantly senior physics classes. She took physics her junior year in high school and was a good student. Through hard work, she was able to develop good understanding of the subject material. Jen also has a personal qualities that are commendable. In the 2 years I've known her, I've never known her to be dishonest or untrustworthy. Once on an exam paper, I made a grading error in her favor. She brought this to my attention, even though it resulted in a low test grade. In conclusion, I feel that Jen has both the academic and personal qualities, blah, blah, blah. This is actually a very common type of recommendation letter. It sounds good when you're reading through it, but there's nothing really compelling. And there's no real depth to this recommendation letter. Most college applicants are going to be very honest, very hardworking, very trustworthy, and they're all applying to these selective institutions or colleges that require recommendation letters. And there's really nothing specifically tangible that's helping with the student's case. And so again, it seems very positive, but when you get into it, there isn't as much depth as like the first letter. And our last letter is about Brian. Brian is in the top 5 in my class consistently. He is certainly motivated to study. His character and personality are admirable. Brian is an excellent student, hard worker, and has above average reasoning ability. This type of letter, I do, when I worked in college admissions, I think I saw a lot of letters like this, and it confuses the admissions committee. And we're not sure if there's really not much to tell about Brian versus the teacher or the college counselor doesn't really want to put much effort there. And so, again, this isn't a letter that's really recommending a student. It's not really helping their case at all. And so we really wanted you guys to see the 3 different types of letters. And again, you can find these actually on the MIT's website. And our last slide here, these are some of helpful resources as you work on recommendation letters. Obviously, the MIT's tips on writing effective letters. The link is provided there. There's college boards, recommendations, tips and whatnot. And then there is a video Vanderbilt's Insider Guide to Writing a Great Letter of Recommendation. That's a YouTube video that's pretty helpful as you get trained on doing these letters. And I found a really fun one from Penn State's University. It's actually from their Earth and Mineral Sciences Department. And they had 10 commandments for writing recommendation letters that can apply to everybody across the board, whether you're a college advisor or a teacher. And that's a fun one to look through just to kind of gauge what to do on a recommendation letter. All right.
We've got obviously a lot of questions that have come through.
Okay.
And one of the ones that I'll talk and want to answer right away is there seems to be a couple about recommending or not recommending, and does that hurt the student? First, I'll back up to the teacher recommendation, which we didn't talk as much about. But I definitely give my teachers the opportunity to say no to writing a letter of recommendation. If the teacher feels they can't write a strong letter of recommendation, they shouldn't write it. So every teacher recommendation should be from a teacher that can absolutely highly recommend that student. We, on the other hand, because we're writing a letter for everybody, or at least in our caseload, we don't always get to highly recommend a student, and we need to be honest. And somebody asked, is it a killer if we say we recommend with reservation? And I think not necessarily. I think it depends on the institution. But I think we need to be honest, because if we're not honest with the admissions folks, it's going to lessen our credibility with them over the years. And so if we say, we recommend this kid with the highest of reservation, and he's going to be an amazing addition to your campus community, and we've not disclosed discipline records, we've not disclosed other things on the student's transcript, and that student gets to the university and ends up being somebody that they don't want to have there, that's something that we want to pass on, because that's going to come back to us, especially as a smaller school where I may have some closer relationships with some of the admissions folks. I want to make sure that I'm doing everything I can to keep that relationship strong, so that maybe if I do have a borderline student, they know they can take a chance on, because I've been honest about my past students. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Joyce, but.
So when I actually have a student who requests for a recommendation letter, and number one, I don't know them very well, I'll state that in whatever I write, or sometimes I'll reach out to the parents and get I'll sit down with the student, get their story, but also I want to know from a parent perspective as well. And not all parents will just tell give a pretty picture of their child, but they will talk about the different struggles and different challenges that they've overcome that sometimes a student is not comfortable sharing all of. But obviously I take it with a grain of salt, and I don't list everything in a recommendation letter. But it helps me to have a better picture of the student. If it's a student who's had discipline issues and whatnot, I personally don't feel good about putting something in writing. And so what I do is, a lot of the forms that you'll fill out as their guidance counselor or college advisor, there's always an area where you can put, please give me a call. And I utilize that section very well for our applicants. I don't feel comfortable writing something negative about. And so, I mean, these recommendation letters are recommendation letters. And so for me personally, I'm not going to put something negative on there, but I do make phone calls, or sometimes the college folks will reach out to me when they see that I've checked that box off, saying, please give me a call, and we'll have a good conversation.
Powerful checkbox, and I definitely recommend you use it.
Yes.
When you don't do it for every kid. It's I don't want to be the counselor who cried wolf. But it's definitely something to use when necessary. Um, Somebody asked a question about uploading letters when students need to upload letters of recommendation, and Joyce said, don't ever give the kids the letters of recommendation. One, I agree with wholeheartedly. My rule of thumb is I always, when the students ask me for their letters of recommendation, both the teacher recs and mine, I say, I'll give it to you when you graduate from college. And I've yet to give a student a letter of recommendation. Because by the time they graduate from college, they've forgotten about the importance of, and I need to see that letter of recommendation. When they need to upload to scholarship competitions, and the reality is hopefully almost all your students are uploading letters of recommendation to scholarship competitions. No scholarship competition is going to not take it from you. And so ask the student for the contact information for that scholarship competition. If you've already used that, worked with that scholarship in the past, send them the letters of recommendation directly. Even in those cases, I still do not give a letter of recommendation to the students. I will contact the college, the scholarship organization. I will explain that we do not provide letters of recommendation to our students, and I will give them the letter of recommendation. I never give it to the student. I never let them upload it. It is private property. There's a reason why they signed the FERPA release. We use, I mentioned it yesterday, we use SCORE as our database of record for the students. The teachers all upload their letters to SCORE. I upload my letters to SCORE and send them off that way electronically. I have one teacher who won't even upload, even though the student cannot, there's no way for the student to access the letters of recommendation in SCORE. I have one teacher who won't upload his letters until the FERPA release is signed by the student in SCORE, because he's like, I'm not going to deal with it. I don't want anybody seeing my letter until they, and he writes excellent letters of recommendation. He never says anything remotely bad about a kid. But he won't upload them to SCORE. He wouldn't upload them to Naviance before until that FERPA release is signed and in the system.
I think one of the questions that came through was, do we provide teachers with information or a workshop for writing letters? I personally, we do during pre-planning before school year officially starts with the students. I do a quick 30-minute session with our high school teachers and do like a little presentation on what to do and not to do. And a lot of the teachers will sometimes, I recommend that they send the letters to me so I can kind of read over it and that to confirm that it is a good letter. And so sometimes teachers do need that guidance from you all as well, because it's important that these letters are well put together, obviously, and tells a clear picture of the applicant.
The biggest thing, and I do it just a little differently, I do my workshop with my teachers at the end of the year. Because they've already all signed contracts with the students to write the letters of recommendation, it's my hope that they write their letters over the summer. I do limit our teachers, depending on the size of the class, the number of letters that they write. So it's generally somewhere between 5 to 10, depending on the size of the senior class. We're a small school. I don't want one my wife teaches U.S. history and teaches the entire junior class. She could write the entire senior class's year's letters of recommendation every year. One, I don't want her doing that. But two, I want it spread out over the teaching. So with this year's senior class, I've capped our teachers at 5. So I do my letter of recommendation writing workshop with them in our year-end meetings in the hope that they write their letters over the summer. But again, I have an October 1st deadline for the teachers to send me their letters. And I will do a quick or ad hoc, any sort of workshops in the fall. If somebody missed the meeting in May and they couldn't attend to it, but I have my stuff. It's all on the Google Drive for them all to see and access whenever they want to. Look at some of the next questions. Advice for new mid-year counselors. Joyce touched on this a little bit. And we've all been new counselors at some point, and we've all had new students. Essentially, they're all new to us. When you come in mid-year, when you come in at the beginning of the year and you've never met the students, my recommendation is just to sit down with the student, do maybe a few more one-on-ones with that student than you would typically do, and just try to get to know them. But as Joyce said, there's nothing wrong with coming out and saying, this is a new student to me, or I'm new to this school and I'm still trying to get to know them. Again, be honest in your letters, and know what you can and can't say about them. There's been some, along those lines, there's been a lot of questions about what you should or shouldn't say in terms of students' disabilities, family situations, things like that. Anytime those topics come up, I think you always have to get families' permission. I'm not going to write about a student's disability if they don't want me to. If they're not disclosing it, they don't have to disclose it to the colleges. I'm not going to disclose it. I'm not going to give the admissions office a reason to judge them. When I was a dean of admission, we would get applications with students' IEPs in them, and I would tell my staff, don't look at them, pass it on to the registrar's office, let them deal with it, because it's like the burning bush. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and you're human, and so you don't want to give them a reason to judge the student if they may have severe ADHD, they may have Asperger's, but that shouldn't affect their admission decision. If the schools that they're applying to can meet those needs, they shouldn't be applying to schools that can't meet their needs in the first place. And so don't disclose something that doesn't need to be disclosed. If it is central to their story, there's a family situation where they've come out of. I've got 2 students at our school that their family are survivors of the Rwandan genocide. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. That's their history, and I think the colleges need to know that we need to know that where these students are coming from. But I have their permission to talk about it as well. And I think that's the key piece, is getting permission from the families before you talk about it.
Another question that came through was, how do you handle recommendations earlier in the school year, like service academies or college ROTC scholarships, or have an August deadline? And I think this is going to be very different according to each individual. I am actually a 12-month employee at our institution, and so I'm here throughout the summer, and I work on recommendation letters throughout the summer. And so, and I know that there's other local high school counselors who may be 10 months, but I think ultimately we are in our profession to serve our students and reaching their goals and dreams. And so we are all essentially working in the summer and helping our students. So I usually have our students reach out to me via email at least, and I'll handle those recommendation letters throughout the summer. And for other co-chairs and faculty, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, I'm writing all summer. I'm actually a 10-month employee, but because of, again, being the only counselor, if I wait till the fall to write my letters, I'm just not going to get them done. I'm just going to have too many other things going on. I'm also the head wrestling coach, which our season starts about mid-October, which is awful timing for college counseling. By the time the season's going, it's great, it's fine, but for those early deadlines, it really pushes me. So that's why I set my own internal deadline of October 1st. Somebody asked the question of, what if a student doesn't need a letter of recommendation? I write a letter for every student, and I get every student to get those teacher recs, because you don't know if they're going to change their mind. I don't want a student to walk into my office on October 30th and tell me that they're applying to a school for a November 1st deadline, and I have to say, well, hold the phone. You were applying to University X that didn't require anything, and I have nothing for you. Now I don't want students walking into my office on October 30th and saying they're applying for November 1st. But if they do, I want to have all the documentation ready to go, and so that I can send them and I can do my job so that they are ready to go for November 1st, and it is smooth sailing. I'm not enabling them to wait till the last minute. We're being planful and ready for them to apply really to anywhere. And because they do change their minds. I had a student a couple of years ago who was applied to University of Alabama, Huntsville. They don't need anything, just test scores, and the transcript. Was all set, had a great scholarship, was going to be an aeronautical engineer, and then changed his mind and wanted to be a philosophy major and apply to the University of the South. So if I hadn't written his letter of recommendation, and I hadn't done all those extra steps, Jarrett wouldn't be at Sewanee right now, because I didn't have that information ready to go. And he had one of those stereotypical went on a service trip to Jamaica and changed, his world changed. So, you know, he went from an aeronautical engineer to a philosophy major overnight, basically. And I was ready to go to be able to. There's been a question a couple times about whether or not IECs should write letters of recommendation. And, you know, I'd love to hear from either Freddie or Kate on the college side on what they think about receiving a letter of recommendation from an independent educational consultant.
Sure. So I think Kate brought up a great point yesterday that we want to hear everybody's opinion. The school counselor, we want to hear if they work with a CBO, we will hear from an IEC. But I think it's also very important to know that letters of recommendation do come from the academic side, because think of it this way. When you have a student in a high school from 7 a.m. until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the letters of recommendation are going to demonstrate their character, not their academic achievements. At Lynn, we're big supporters of IECA and HECA, but we will not accept a letter of recommendation from an IEC because there's certain tidbits that the student can do within a community that the independent counselor may not be able to see. For example, the way they communicate with their classmates, the way that they communicate with a teacher, with a faculty member. We had a student that I remember the letter of recommendation vividly and never spoke about their academics, but it spoke about how every time they went to lunch, this school counselor would see how they would sit with someone eating by themselves. I don't remember anything else, but I remember that, and that to me made a world of a difference. So even though at Lynn we're strong supporters of IECA and HECA, we unfortunately will not receive a letter of recommendation from an IEC.
Yeah, I'm happy to second what Freddie said. It's tough, and I think, you know, this goes back to a good point of a good question earlier, which is, you know, talking about the letter of recommendation and its value, especially in these test optional, test flexible times, is that when we're looking at students across a certain school, be it that the counselor has a 500-person caseload or a 20-person caseload, we can look at things within the school still, right? So I want you to know that, you know, as far as getting an additional piece, we always welcome those. We always welcome additional opinions, but we still need to look at the student in the context of the school and where they're coming from. So, and that's not to say that a student that is in a part of the school that has a really large caseload, they're not going to get a lesser opinion, right? Because their counselor, their representative may have more folks on their plate. I promise you that. We look at those things, we value those things, we take those into account, but we do have to kind of use that as a unifying source within the school, if that makes sense.
We're obviously, as we've said before, we've got lots of questions. I think we've gotten to most of the big ones that have come through. We will continue to go through the chat and make sure that some just didn't get lost in the shuffle there. But I think one of the closing points is that I'd make is that you want to make sure that you're doing what works for you in your office. My previous office, there was myself and 3 other counselors. So we had a 4-person counseling staff, plus a full-time administrative assistant. My world changed drastically coming down here to Sewanee. But you know, we did things a little differently there because we had 4 counselors. If you're in a bigger office with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 counselors, you can do things a little differently. When you're an office of 1, you have to do things what work for you. And what I tell students all the time, what I tell teachers all the time, what I tell my head of school all the time, there is no emergency in college admission. Everything can be done on a certain timeline. We submit things like 90 9% of the stuff we submit is going electronically, whatever system you're using. And so, you know, it literally takes 2 seconds for me to send a complete packet to an application. But again, one of the reasons why I back everything up to that October 1st deadline is so that I have everything ready to go for that student, and I can submit that stuff. Once I get one application in for a student, I'm essentially done for that student. And so if this is your first year in college counseling, you know that you got to get everything ready to go for that one student. But once you get it ready to go for one application, it's ready to go for every other application. And so you got to do what works for you. If you love the crunch of working at the last minute and you want to work on Halloween to get everything done for the November 1st deadline, go ahead and do it. I don't. I like having things done and sitting there and ready to go. I've got too many other things going on, and again, being an office of one, I do have a little bit of support in that I have an intern I have a ongoing internship with the University of the South, which is a great partner of ours right next door. If you get on their college, their counselor tour, if you want, they do 2 tours a year for counselors. Come visit beautiful Sewanee, Tennessee. You know, I think that's, again, it's got to work for you. Again, I'm only a 10-month employee, but I'm writing my letters when I'm unpaid during the summer because I have to. I can't imagine starting to write my letters August 17th when we start back at the beginning of the school year, when my door is constantly being opened by students coming into the college counseling office just to hang out and talk, which is great. That's what I want. But if I'm sitting there trying to write letters and I've got 10 kids sitting in my office, well, I won't have 10 kids this year because of COVID, but you know, you get the point. Is there any questions that I'm trying to look through the chat? I think, again, we've answered them, but if there's any other burning questions, certainly throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we will, we're about to our break time, and we will take a 10-minute break. We're going to pause the recording during the break, and then we will we'll join, come back up for NCAA arts and other special talents after the break.
All right.
Kate, you want me to do it?
Yes, because for some reason it tells me it does not want to share mine.
Okay.
Let me see. See, and look at Beverly's working perfectly.
You know, it's all the water.
Right. So I'm going to get started by saying it is, I think I got to do this presentation with Dan and Bev before, and one of the things I will say, it is the most humorous irony that I ended up working at a fine and performing arts college. I am tone deaf. I cannot dance. I cannot sing. I cannot do theater. And I was a collegiate athlete. So all of that combined, I can tell you from the high school side, I think one of the most intimidating things you have to do is offer advice on something that you don't feel like you're an expert in. So we're going to try and give you some tools, some tips, some basic elements to get you started, so that you feel like you can give good, grounded advice to those students who are looking at something, be it, you know, music or athletics or one of those special talents that maybe you're not as familiar with. So I think first slide here is our pros of visual and performing arts. And there are 2 ways that I want you to kind of look at this. So the first is a conservatory or an arts type college. So those are your students who are saying, this is what I want to do. This is my career. I am going to be a musician. I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to be a designer. And that is what I want to study all day, every day, in and out. I don't need to do anything else. I don't want to take many other classes. I just want to be very embedded in my talent. The other one is to be part of getting an arts degree in a traditional college format. So you would still be part of the core curriculum, things like that. So you can see we tried to separate it into pros on one section and then cons on the other. So when you look at your traditional college or university that has a strong performing arts program, it could be seen as the best of both worlds, right? So you could come in, you might want to get a dual degree. You might want to go through pre-health advising. You might want to go through, take some philosophy classes or get to expand on something else you're really interested in. And that gives you the option to easily do that. It also gives you more options typically. So there are lots of colleges with good or great theater programs or music programs that you can be part of and still be part of the larger college as a whole. For some of your students that are musicians, the marching band component might be more of what they're looking for, right? And that is going to come at your bigger schools, not your conservatories as well. Typically, there are a lot of different options in terms of financial aid or scholarships at those programs. So you might still get an academic scholarship, even if you don't get a music scholarship. And then let's say, as so many students do, your mind changes. You're going to have a better opportunity to take credits that can go somewhere else, right? If you're within that traditional college and you need to transfer or to look at other options in the college realm. For the arts college, now, there are students that are so successful in the conservatory setting. They go in, they work hard. That's all they wanted. It's all they wanted to do. And they want to do that every single day. And it's a beautiful experience for them. These places have wonderful alums that are in talented groups, are performing on very talented stages. And you can have the opportunity to, oh boy,
Sorry.
No worries. To really get a chance to connect with those faculty and staff that may be performing in pretty high-end arenas. These places are typically going to be located near hubs, right? So some sort of, design performance hub where you can really have the opportunity to hop on the stage. So those are kind of some of your pros on both sides. So our next one we're going to look at is talking about some of the cons, which I think you can probably guess from some of my pros. So one of the things I often have to talk to families about is that in a traditional college with an arts program, we still have to admit you to the college. And those are still very separate processes. So for example, in our office, the application for admission is still read by the admissions officers. There is no different process for that. Then we bring in our music and media rep and our faculty and staff to look at the performing or media side of things, right? But we still do an academic review. So we still look at the same traditional elements you look at for each student that's coming into the building, right? It can be that there are smaller faculty or they're spread more thinly. They're trying to do different things. It can be that there's a very precise amount of programs. So maybe if you had an interest in more musical theater than traditional theater, there may be a lighter number of classes in that. And it's going to push you to be a part of more things. So you got to decide kind of, if you want to separate yourself out, if you want to have different experiences outside of your performing experiences. For the arts university or colleges, one of the big things you have to talk to students about is making sure that they're attending an accredited option. So working with students to make sure they're looking at conservatories or art schools that are accredited and do offer them an accredited degree once they finish. It can be difficult. So when we have students that come to us that are looking to leave a conservatory type background, it can be hard to transfer their credits. So if they're going to another conservatory, it might not be as hard. But if they're going and they're leaving and they want to go into a different degree program or go to a degree program with a general education curriculum, it can be hard to transfer those credits and take them with them. And it's also when you go to those full arts colleges, there can be a highly competitive environment. So it's keeping in mind that it could be putting themselves in a competition-based element more so than a collaboration-based element. So let's talk a little bit about the process and how we could help students either explore their options or help them be prepared to explore their options. So the first big one is NACAC does performing visual arts fairs. So that is an option for a student to go in. Typically that's staffed by someone within the office that is very familiar with all the music and media degree programs. Sometimes music or media faculty are also in attendance at these PVAs. It's a great time to walk the room, to network, and to really go out there and see who all is offering what you're looking for. Sometimes we get students from that who didn't even know that we had certain programs. It just gives them a chance to view all of their options in a singular setting. They have not made their official announcement if those are going to go virtual yet or not this year, but if they are virtual, since those are offered in a smaller amount of cities, it may be a really great year for your students to really dig into those, because they might get to see some schools and talk to people that they might not regularly get to see. So the great special applications, this is where I tell my music and media students, they do have a pretty tough job. They've got to be prepared that each college is going to ask for probably slightly different yet similar audition or portfolio requirements. So things to kind of look for. So when you're looking at your art portfolio, you know, having about 10 to 12 works that show a variety of skills. You're going to need to have those pretty much ready to upload. You can use Slide Room, which is a part of Common App. Personally, we have one that lets them upload directly into their portal. It's just going to depend by the school. Most of us are going to have plenty of options for them to upload those, but making sure that they have a portfolio that shows the depth and the breadth of their work. Most of us are all going to have it outlined on our websites as well. So if they want to start making a very comprehensive list of schools they're interested in, they can do that as well. Auditions, typically a couple of pieces or a video of a performance. It can really depend from place to place. A lot of us also participate in things like, we just finished up doing Texas Thespians Festival. So we did that, and if a student, if a performer is called back within that, we actually waive their audition process. So we were at Interlochen as well. So it's pretty much, there are different options for students to showcase that. And it's a good idea to make sure that if you need to, and students especially right now, it might be more complicated to get access to some of those recordings or videos. So having those students who are thinking about doing this start thinking creatively about, you know, and if they don't have a performance this year, looking back at older performances or looking at doing, you know, a smaller individual reading, you know, something they can still present at this point. I know we're all going to have to get a little bit more flexible as we see how many performances happen in this upcoming year. Recommendation letters, a lot of those typically need something from the arts faculty. And this is where I also say, you know, to lean on your arts and media faculty members, because they're going to be able to help those students navigate. If they have questions, you know, I had students bring me their portfolio when I was working on the high school side, and I'm like, this looks great. It's infinitely better than I can do, but that's, you know, I don't have a lot of feedback for you. So don't be afraid to really, you know, help and lean on your faculty and your folks who know this world, who understand this world, who say, yes, that does show this. And you do have some folks at schools that are willing to take a cursory look at a student's portfolio. And even if they're not highly, you know, interested in that school, it could be good for them to garner some outside feedback from them as well. And I know we have some questions, and I'm trying to keep myself on track. So I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID, and then I'll grab a question or two, and then I want to leave a good bit of the time for Dan and Bev here, because lots going on with NCAA this year. So COVID. The audition circuit. So like I said, older work, if your students have some older pieces or some older performances recorded, you may have to use more amateur video recorded at home. We understand that as well. And, you know, most of us have and will create a system by which we can review everything online or virtually. So just have your students prepared that there could be very different elements. You know, I don't know, maybe they'll be reading monologues in a virtual setting. It's going to be interesting to see what creative ways we all come up with to make sure these students can still apply to these programs. Obviously, this all goes into performances are still going to be affected. You know, I'm watching our own students in our own college ask about spring performances and things, and we're doing the best that we can. We're going to try and make sure that we have those, but you know, It's telling students to think creatively, and these are creative kids. And if you unleash the creativity, I'm excited actually to see what they're going to come up with and what they can think to do with each other in terms of the virtual world as well. So like I said, you see some summer intensives. A lot of those have moved online, virtual. So this is a good time when maybe your student, like I was talking about with the potential for the PVA, this might be a chance for your student to participate in that they didn't have before. So exploring some of those options. And a lot of times I know those summer intensives have been, big gateways for students into auditioning for multiple schools at one time. I'm hoping a lot of those are taken virtual. A lot of folks, it's just like the high school visits and things, we're waiting for final words. But the colleges are still going to step up and find ways to participate in those. The last one I would say is equipment. I should have written equipment instead of just instruments, but I'm running into a lot of students who use school-based equipment or instruments. So if you haven't talked to your high school about any plans to help students have access or gain access to those, please talk to your administrators, principals, folks about that, because I do have a few kids that they're stuck because school closed. Their mom was like, no, the bassoon cannot fit in the car today, and they don't have an instrument right now, which is not anywhere near their fault, right? This is an uncontrollable situation. So just make sure that you're talking to your kids and you're having that conversation. You're kind of preparing your school and your administration for that. So I'm kind of looking, sorry guys, I gotta pull up my chat here and see if there's any quick ones that I can answer really quick. So we talked a little bit about some of the for-profit colleges. Do letters have to be from arts faculty? No. So sometimes, dedicated teachers. Okay, yeah. So if you are thinking about letters of recommendation, they don't necessarily have to come from the arts faculty. So it's really going to depend on what the college's particular requirement is. So for us, it's still a teacher letter of recommendation. You can use your faculty as an additional support. Some folks may want to hear from a private instructor, or they may want to see who your private instructor is. We do have opportunities for students to fill that out on our application, but we don't require a letter or anything from that person. It's again part of helping them fill out the entire application, but as a non-conservatory school, we don't need specifically from the arts faculty, but that may be a requirement in other places. All right, it is 9:22. I'm going to try and return some of these answers really quick in the chat as Dan and Bev are talking, but I'll be here again at the end if we have some time and afterwards.
All right. The next part of the presentation has to do more with athletics, obviously. So with students figuring out kind of what division might make sense, what their next step might be, acknowledging that I work in a bit of a unique scenario. So when I worked in college counseling in Memphis, I was at a traditional independent school. About a quarter of my students or student athletes. Where I am now, all of my students are elite soccer players. So about 15% sign professional contracts, and then the rest play Division I soccer. But I'll have one or two a year that decide that they're over it. So like I have one going to Alabama this fall to study astrophysics. So, everybody's different. But this is an opportunity for us to go over what it's like to work with athletes, whether they're, high level or whether they want to go D3. And so we want to make sure to go through all of that. So the first piece is what the process looks like. So it involves, you'll see PSA a lot, which is the prospective student athlete. It involves the PSA, their family, usually at least one high school or club coach. And a lot of that will depend on what type of athlete it is. I worked with a gymnast at St. George's who was a gym back at Arkansas, and gymnastics wasn't a school sport. So a lot of our interactions had to do with working with her gymnastics coach outside of school rather than with a member of our staff. It can often include the high school athletic department if they're an athlete within the school. It'll either be the school counselor or the college counselor, sometimes both. It really depends on the structure of your office. And then obviously the people on the college side. So admissions, college coaches, it might even involve compliance. It really just depends. The process itself has ebbs and flows even for the most highly sought after athletes. And that has a lot to do with the calendar, right? There are dead periods, which we'll talk about in a bit, where students can't receive any information of any kind. And then there are other pieces where sometimes there's just nothing to talk about, right? We were saying yesterday, don't email your admission counselor every week if there's nothing to talk about. The recruiting process is similar. And you'll find that some students will feel like they're losing ground because they haven't heard from anybody in a week or two, but it's possible. It's just, there's nothing to talk about. Depending on the caliber of the athlete, it could include official visits. So an official visit is when the school pays for the student to visit the school. So that's, flight, that's hotel, that's food while they're on campus. If they go to a basketball game or a hockey game, those tickets are paid for. All of those things are included. And every student can have 5 of those. And you can't have more than 1 to any one school unless the coaching staff changes. Official visits are not the be all and end all. A lot of my students think they are, and I have to remind them that that's not usually the case. There are some schools where they actually do an unofficial for every first visit, whether it's their number 1 recruit or not, because they save all the official visits for the senior year when the boys have actually committed. And then all the recruits come to campus who are starting there in the fall, and they get to all visit at the same time with their families, and then everything is paid for. So that's really helpful. Unofficial visits, the visit looks the same, it's just not paid for. And so that's where I encourage my students to bring cash with them, as well as a debit card if they can, because they'll probably need to pay for food. They might go to a movie or something, and so you want to make sure they have cash for that. I often encourage my students, if they're going on an official visit, to make sure it's a place that's not necessarily drivable, because you don't want to use up your official visits on places that are closer to home, right? Because they'll reimburse you for gas, but if it was just an hour away, then what was the point of using an official visit, right? Financial aid looks very different at every college, right? We learned that from Freddie yesterday, but it's sometimes more confusing for student athletes because they also have to contend with the other pieces, whether that's institutional aid or athletic aid. There are some schools that allow you to stack athletic aid, so scholarship from the athletic department, and academic aid and need-based aid. And then there are other places that only allow you to do one or the other. And so I have a lot of students where their packages look different every year, depending on whether they're on merit aid, athletic aid, or they're on need-based aid. And it can go back and forth. And again, every school is different. The high school athletic department might end up handling a great deal of this. That was the case at St. George's. I didn't have a ton of exposure to the full recruiting process as much as I did with helping students make their final decision, interpret some of the emails they got from coaches, which I'll show to you a bit later. But you are an essential part of this process, regardless of where you fall in it. And so that's why I want to make sure you're aware of it. So hopefully it ends up with everybody smiling and happy and hugging. This picture is interesting because these 3 boys have such divergent paths. One actually left our program and is still on a full ride to a 4-year D1 institution. One of them gave up his full scholarship to sign a professional contract, and the third got a C in a class that he needed to get a B in order to be eligible. And so he wasn't NCAA eligible. So every part of the process is different. As long as you're there to support your students, they will be successful at some point. I always laugh that NCAA eligibility is the easy part because it's not, right? The kids have to be NCAA eligible, but figuring out if they're eligible or not is the easy part. In the documents that we'll send to you at the end of all of this, that Google Drive that has all of our information, you're going to find all of these. But I want to make sure that you're familiar specifically with the document on the left and the document on the right. The Division I worksheet, there's also a Division II worksheet. And you can do this. And in fact, Coach Dan included in those files a way to calculate it on your own. I just do it by hand because I'm old school. But you put in the classes that fall for each student. I have my students do this themselves. We do it every year together. Not only because math is not my gift, but also because I want them to be good stewards of their own academic information and also their trajectory. I want them to know what they're taking junior year. I don't feel like I should always be the one to tell them because they're the ones talking to coaches, right? So you need 4 years of English in order to be NCAA eligible, 3 years of math, 2 years of natural or physical science. One of those needs to be a lab if they're offered at your school, and then an extra of one of those 3. Now, to be fair, it's pretty rare that you're going to have a 5th year of English or 2 English classes in 1 year, though not impossible. And so typically you pull that from either math or science. As a school, we require 4 years of math and 3 years of science, partially because all of our classes need to be NCAA approved, and that's a chance to start switching in classes. Part of why I love doing NCAA eligibility, which might sound sick, is because it's like choreography, right? You're putting together a puzzle. So if a student bombed Algebra 1 but absolutely nailed pre-calculus, you can actually take Algebra 1 out of the equation and put pre-calculus in, and then you start mixing and matching what works for their eligibility. Below that, you'll see there are 2 years required of social science. We as a school require 3, again, so you can add in that 3rd one. And then there's additional academic courses, 4 years required. That's where language goes: Spanish, French, German, Italian, Russian, Arabic, whatever it is your school offers, it can go there. Any of the extras of the categories above, so that extra math class if you didn't use it, the extra science class if you didn't use it, the extra social science classes if you didn't use them. The things that can't go in there are the things I always say the NCAA doesn't want you to better yourself. So it can't be anything that's personally beneficial. So a psychology class that focuses on personal betterment of some sort, a personal finance class, those things can't go in there. The one big question mark that changes depending on the school is art. So art typically is not allowed to be one of those 4 additional core courses unless the school requires you to take an art class. So I have 2 boys who play at Cal Poly SLO, so in San Luis Obispo, and they require art as an admission requirement. And so both boys took an art class, and that one in one of those 4. So again, it's different for every school. But the important piece to know about this in terms of the math is that minuses and pluses don't count. And that's why I stress to my students constantly that your grades really matter, because if you got a B+ when you could have gotten an A-, that differential in your regular GPA might not actually be that substantial, but to the NCAA it is, because then it's the difference between having a 4 and having a 3, right? So the quality points, you multiply the credit by the grade, and then you figure out their NCAA GPA. This chart over here on the right is the sliding scale. So the higher a student's GPA is, the lower their test scores need to be, which is great. Now there are certainly minimums that you have to have. You can't have anything lower than a 2.3, even if you have the test score that corresponds or even higher than that, because then you become an academic red shirt. So my goal is always to make sure that my students are not in red shirt territory, because that can make them more difficult in being recruited, even your top athletes, because then they'll have to sit. So trying to find ways to get creative. Also making sure if you're working with any students who have transferred into your school, I made the rookie mistake my first year of assuming that schools all have NCAA approved classes. Why wouldn't all schools have NCAA approved classes? And the reality is that's just not the case. Some schools don't go through that process. Some schools don't put their students into those classes. Lots of schools have caseloads that are too large for counselors to know that students are potentially Division I, Division II athletes. And so you get into a sticky situation where kids might be transferring in. This is what happened to me. I had a junior transfer in, and it turned out his first 2 years of school, he only took 2 NCAA eligible classes, and he has to have taken substantially more than that. So he basically had to repeat his first 2 years of high school in the midst of his 3rd year of high school, because so few of his classes transferred over. And if you look at this worksheet over here on the left, you'll see 10/7 with check marks. 10/7 is an NCAA ruling. It means you have to have completed 10 core courses by the beginning of your 7th semester, which is the beginning of your senior year. And he would not have met 10/7 because he only took 2 from his freshman year. He didn't have, well, 1 from his freshman year, 1 from his sophomore year. By the time he got to his junior year, he probably would have only taken 5 from us, and that would have put him at 7 when he needed 10. So summer school counts in this, just so you know, but that's something to keep in mind, is that it's important to check. The NCAA has a totally accessible website where you can type in your school, you can type in the school that a transfer student came from, and you can see exactly what classes are approved. And I do that with our students who transfer in it used to be next to me. This year, who knows what we'll do. But we do that process together so that way they know where they are. Again, I want them to be the drivers of this process. I'm supportive as much as I can. Like Dan, I have a very small caseload, but I also have to manage a lot of the processes at my school, because other than my head of school, I'm the only other senior administrator. So I'm not able to do all of the small pieces. And so it's my goal to empower my students to make sure that they can do these things on their own. And so that piece is important to make sure they understand that. So when we're selecting courses, they're doing the right thing. All right, Coach Dan, it's all you.
All me. So first, I'm gonna start by saying I was a Division I college football player. I played in the Patriot League at College of the Holy Cross. So I've been through this process as I guess I could say, highly recruited student athlete. Very different process when I went through it than some of my players who are playing at Texas and Alabama and other places like that now. It's very much so a different recruitment process, especially for high caliber players. We didn't have stars and all that when I was in high school. Peyton Manning, will tell you that he didn't have any stars coming out of high school, and he's arguably one of, if not the greatest quarterbacks ever. So it depends. And then I think the other thing that I want to say is the biggest misnomer is that there are people that believe anybody can play Division III, and Division III is open to anybody. Division III is not anybody can play. At some institutions, it is, arguably. My younger brother, who is physically built just like me, played Division III football. I have an older brother who played Division I football. I have another older brother who played Division I college volleyball, who does not look anything like me. But the difference is that athletics depends on within Division I, there's different levels of playing ability, and because you have in college football, you have the FBS division and then the FCS division, which used to be, when I played, Division 1A and 1AA. I played 1AA football. So the student athlete needs to know what is the right fit for them, just like we talk about right fit in college admissions. And from an admissibility standpoint, you need to look about their ability to play. I have a football player at St. Andrews who wants to play at Alabama. He's not big enough to be the water boy at Alabama. So I'm telling him that it's just not going to happen. He's like, no, I went to camp at Alabama and I met Coach Saban. I'm like, that's great. Not going to happen. Let's turn our attention to other places. It's just, you have to be honest with it, with the student athletes. Bev mentioned earlier, the athletic department may be involved. I highly recommend butting your way into every single one of those conversations, because in the end, we're going to play such a big role in terms of sending transcripts to the NCAA, sending transcripts to coaches, and being involved in the process. My previous school, Cheshire Academy, real high end in terms of athletic participation. Almost 60% of the graduates went on to play college sports. I had one year where we had 13 FBS football players. That's an entire starting offense or defense. I mean, that doesn't really happen. That was an abnormal year. But you need to be involved in the process. And depending on the school, what you see on the slide here, there's different selectivity ranges. Students that are eligible to play in the NESCAC have to be, the NESCAC is the New England Small Athletic Conference, Small School Athletic Conference, Williams, Amherst, Bates, Bowdoin, Tufts, Colby, etc. They need to be the best student athletes, and they may get a tip in from athletics, but they still need to be admissible to the school. The Patriot League and the Ivy League, Division I, FCS division, Division I for all other sports, FCS for football, uses the academic index. And you need to be able to meet the academic index. You see the information on the academic index. There's a screenshot of what the calculator looks like. A student with a perfect SAT, perfect subject test, and a 4.0 GPA is the only one that gets the highest rating on the academic index. A 3.9 puts them at the next level, even with perfect test scores. So, the fallacy is that, well, football players go to Harvard because it's easier to get into. It's not. they have to meet the admission standards. I have football players at Harvard. I have football players at Yale. I have a football player at Stanford. And I can tell you that Stanford football player met the same criteria if you've got any other students at Stanford. They may have been a little lower, but they were still well within the range of what Stanford's looking at. So you need to find that balance between academic admission and athletic admission. Even at a place like Alabama, where it's a turnover factory for the NFL, the students need to meet admission criteria. And where Bev talked about the closer to the redshirt index, and that's on the sliding scale, Alabama's not going to take anybody that's in that redshirt band because they want everybody to, they may redshirt half their freshmen, but they want them all to be eligible to play right away freshman year. They don't want to waste a year of eligibility if they don't have to on a student athlete. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as you're looking at the ability. But what I come down to is I'm honest and I'm blunt with my student athletes in this process. We need to look at the win-loss records of the schools. We need to look at the history of the schools. We need to look at the types of student athletes they've enrolled in the past. If that student is perfectly fine being a bench warmer, but getting all the free gear for 4 years, great, pick that Division I institution. But if that student athlete wants to play and contribute, maybe they look at either a lower tier Division I school or Division II, Division III. I have a baseball player at Northeastern University. He has not seen the field, but it's Division I baseball, and he's playing Division I baseball, and that's all that matters. I've got a basketball in the same situation, basketball player at Penn State. Both of them would have been stars at the Division III level, probably would have been All-Americans, but they wanted, it was D1 or bust for them. And if you have student athletes with that mentality, I would do everything I can to bust that, because for me, as a former student athlete, it was the joy of playing and the experience of having that, not just going for the free gear and saying I'm a Division I football player. I wanted to go be a Division I football player, get the best possible academic experience I could, and also play for 4 years. And I think that's the most important thing. And when you're looking at the academic caliber of the students. Let's turn it back over to you, Bev, for the next slide.
And this is just a slide that points to Dan's point. So even when you're looking at the lower level schools, which by the way, this screenshot is probably 2 years old, and since then Navy almost went undefeated in men's soccer this past year. So these rankings change constantly, but what I often remind my students is that even the lower tiers within Division I, that team is full of kids who were All-Americans and all-conference and started every game and played every minute. And so,
and also to that point, it's not just Division I schools that are that way. You know, the difference between a Division I and III football player is probably an inch or two in height, and maybe a tenth of a second on a 40-yard dash. You know, a Division III football player at a highly recruited institution could play at a Division I institution. Maybe if they were just a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit faster, but they're the same. They're not just somebody who picked up football in their senior year and said, oh, I think I can go play at Millikan University. Well, no, Millikan University has won the majority of their games over the last 2 decades. They're a winning program. Mountain Union. Think about some of those programs where the students are so it's Division I, II, and III. And it can change in a year with a big recruiting class. And I think that's the important thing to remember.
Absolutely. It's also important to pay attention to the NAIA and to the NJCAA. So the Junior College Athletic Association, those schools, as well as NAIA, which I would put on tier mostly with Division II in terms of the level of competition. I think oftentimes those leagues get ignored, and they shouldn't be, because they still offer athletic scholarships for your students who may not be academically eligible. They provide different ways to become academically eligible. So with the NAIA, you have to meet 2 of their 3 academic standards. So you have to have above a certain GPA, you have to be in the top 50% of your class, and then you have to have an 18 on the ACT. And you have to meet 2 of those 3. Now, to be fair, you pretty much have to meet the test score requirement, because it's unlikely, I think it's a 2.0 is the GPA. It's unlikely that you have a 2.0 and you're in the top 50% of your class, right? So usually it's that you're meeting the test score and then you're meeting one of the two grade requirements. But that's also an opportunity, and one that I don't think enough students take seriously. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. One piece, and this is where I usually start with my students, when it comes to putting together a list. Again, like I said yesterday, my first conversation with students about lists have nothing to do with athletics, right? It has to do with how far away from home they want to be, what they think they might want to study, what pieces to campus are important. Are they okay being someplace rural or in a college town? Do they want to be in or near a city? All of those pieces are so important. This obviously makes the process more complex, right? Because they have to be even more focused in terms of athletic programs. But I always say there's also a larger reward, right? You have a group of people that you already know, you've connected with, you already have mentors on campus. And so those pieces are also really valuable. But this is the best place to start. And I'm going to show you 3 different parts of the website that's important for them to look at. The first is the listing of the coaches, because that's where you get contact information. So this is the coaching staff at Indiana University for the men's soccer team, and you'll note that their head coach doesn't have an email address. He does. It's just not advertised, because he's not interested in being contacted by recruits, because that's not his job. In fact, you see that Kevin Robeson is the recruiting coordinator. That's his job. So when students are reaching out to coaches, which I'll go over in just a minute, it's important to know that those pieces, they want you to reach out specifically to the recruiting coordinator or the assistant coach. If all the contact information is included, I would stop at anywhere that says volunteer or undergraduate. So assistant coaches and the head coach are the best place to start. But this is how you get information. And each of my boys keeps a Google sheet with all of this contact information in it. And then we track the last time they spoke to them by text or by email. So that way we can see who's kind of falling behind and who's starting to rise to the top. The next piece that I have them do is go immediately to the roster, and that's for 2 different reasons. The first is to get a sense of physically, to Dan's point, what do their soccer players or their football players or their cross-country athletes, whoever it is, what do they look like? What is their build? Because so look at this, we've got 3 forwards at Indiana, one's 6 foot, one's 6'1", and one's 5'10", right? So if you are 5'5", the likelihood of you being a forward at Indiana, it's small. It's not impossible. I always tell kids, like, this process is the great equalizer. You want to reach out, they don't respond, you got your answer, right? But it's good to be realistic, and I always make sure that my boys are. The other piece that's really important is to see what year kids are. And this is why I have students cast somewhat of a wide net initially. Because the reality is that you could be excellent and they just don't have a need for you positionally. Right? So if you only emailed your top 5 schools and nobody needs a defensive midfielder, well then it doesn't mean you're not great. It means that they don't have a need for you, right? So this part can often help you take care of that. If they have a freshman, a sophomore, and a redshirt sophomore, the likelihood is they don't need a forward for right now. And so that might be a possibility later down the road if somebody transfers or whatever, but that might not be a school to put on your list right now if you're a forward. The last piece to look at is just the recruiting questionnaire. I make all of my students fill these out. It's often how they get information for that June 15th deadline, which is the first time that coaches can talk to rising juniors. And so you've got all the information in there already. It asks for biographical information. It'll ask for your cell phone number. For students, the piece that I always caution them with is including their social media handles. Coaches will find you. And I remember in admissions, I feel like we talked about this all the time. Right, we would get asked constantly, are you going on Facebook? Are you going on Instagram? Are you checking, what these kids are doing? And in admissions, the answer is generally no, because nobody has time for that. But coaches have all the time for that. And they are very interested in making sure that you are representing yourself well. So if you're not, don't put your stuff on there and don't let them follow you. And if you are, that's great. But my rule of thumb with my kids generally is, if you wouldn't let your grandma see it, don't post it. That being said, I think that it's important for students to know, and we have conversations about social media and being good digital citizens all of the time, because some of my students are more forward facing than others, and often can have more public followings. And so in that regard, we have a lot of conversations about who you represent when you put yourself out to the world. And I think that conversation is universal, right? Your student doesn't just represent themselves, they represent their family, they represent their school, they represent the teams they play for. And so that's a really important conversation to have about social media. And this is a great time to have it because they're about to start gaining traction, regardless of what division they're going to play. Dan, do you want to talk a bit about timelines and dead periods real quick?
Yeah, so the biggest thing to keep in mind on timelines, there's periods of the year when coaches cannot contact students. The recruitment timeline has continued to shift over the years. Again, back when I was in high school in the 90s, it was pretty much junior, senior year. Now students, particularly spring sports, students are being recruited as early as 8th grade, freshman year. They can't officially be recruited, but they can be observed and they can be watched. And certainly college coaches are keeping an eye on them. The NCAA has come down a little harder on the July 1 opening after junior year of recruiting than they have in years past. The one thing to keep in mind is we'll talk about this a little bit later too in our last slide about COVID, but there is some things I hope and I think are going to shift because of COVID. Certainly they did it for the class of 2020, but hopefully they'll continue to shift for the class of 2021, 2022. Et cetera, because all these students, all of our currently enrolled high school students are impacted by COVID with pass-fail classes, with the tests not being offered and tests being required for Division I, Division II. But it's important to pay attention to the dead periods and know when the students cannot be contacted. I always tell students if they are interested in a program, they can initiate the contact. The coaches can't always reply. But they can at least reply and say it's a dead period, and I can't respond to you right now, but I can when I will. And there's loopholes. Colleges can and believe me, they all know the loopholes. So that's why I tell the students to reach out because if they are truly a recruited student athlete, and Bez's going to talk about that in the next couple slides, whether they're a recruited student athlete or they just got their name on a list because they showed up at a showcase. You know, the coaches will respond in some way if they can.
And within this, so any sport that you're looking at has a recruiting calendar that will tell you exactly when your students are allowed to do things and be responded to and when they're not. And so you can really empower yourself with that information, but also make sure that students have it as well. On a prior slide, I showed a picture of the 2020-2021 NCAA guide to the student athlete. I would recommend that you send that to all of your recruited athletes, but I also think you should peruse it. It does have a couple of COVID updates, not as many as we'd like, obviously, but it will walk through the entire process, D1, D2, and D3 for all of your students. Very briefly, I'm going to go over the communication pieces because to Dan's point, there are going to be some coaches who use loopholes and others who play by the books, and it's important to know kind of how to navigate that. But students can communicate with coaches by email, the recruiting questionnaire I mentioned. Texts and calls can happen after June 15th, after their sophomore year. They can visit campus, hopefully at some point, and then sending game film and a highlight tape. A lot of that depends on what sport it is. Right? Like with cross country, it's more likely you're sending times. Swimming, you're probably sending times. With soccer, with football, again, with sports where game film is important, that's going to be different. And for my students, I have them send both, but only sending highlight film if it's asked for. Most coaches prefer to see game film because they also want to see what you're doing when you don't have the ball. And especially for my goalkeepers, I have them send game film just because they're kind of, directing things from the back. So they're instrumental no matter what. Coaches will use ID camps. They'll email, text, and calls. They might come watch a game or watch training. They might work through the high school or the club coach. And then sometimes when they can't talk to the student, they'll often talk to the parents or to alums that are already a part of their program. One piece that I would be mindful of with ID camps is just that they can get incredibly expensive. And so I encourage any student who's interested in an ID camp to make sure that it's worth the investment, because oftentimes it's just a moneymaker for the college. It's not necessarily an identification opportunity for students. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to be for your student, but I would encourage students who are looking at ID camps to go for ones where the faculty of the camp represent more than just that institution, so that way you get more exposure, and also the ID camps that represent more than one school. So like 5 schools will come together and do an ID camp. That's often a good bang for your buck as well. In here, we're going to include some emails that just show what students should be sending, but also what the emails from coaches look like, so that way you know the difference between a blast email that got sent to everyone versus a blast email on your interest, a personal email, but they're not totally in. Anything that mentions an ID camp after June 15th, after sophomore year, is a good indicator that they're not as interested, right? The ones that are interested are the ones where you'll see down here, he includes his cell phone number. This one says, you know, it's totally generated by the coach, not at all by the student's interest. It gives the cell phone number. It mentions he talked to me. That's what you're looking for, because students will get emails constantly from schools and they don't actually mean that they're interested. And so it's good for you to have this as a reference point so that you can help students understand what coaches are actually interested and what is a spammy email, right? Like this one, these are both from Mike Miller at UConn, who's a lovely man. But this one is obviously a blast email, right? Like at least this one is a regular email in response to an email. So
one thing I'll throw in there too.
Yeah,
I had a wide receiver on our football team a few years back who was highly sought after, number 1 in the state of Connecticut, number 7 in the country. He was heavily recruited to the nth degree. A lot of our other players were recruited because of Tariq. They were not recruited. They were recruited to entice Tariq to be enrolled in their institution. Tariq ended up choosing University of Michigan, and now he's a grad transfer at the University of Texas. If you have a highly sought after student athlete, the other kids probably aren't being recruited, but they're being recruited to get that highly sought after recruit to try and get a 2-for-1. They'll take an extra body to get the 5-star recruit.
right. And I should say that doesn't happen in men's soccer. Nobody cares about men's soccer that much. So it's going to be happening in football and basketball, not a whole lot.
It happens in the revenue sports.
Absolutely, yeah. And just real quick with COVID. So the recruiting dead period, currently no coaches are allowed to do anything in person with recruitment activities until August 31st. That's been extended twice, maybe 3 times already. It is likely to continue to be extended. And I often say, like, that's not really because of men's soccer or cross country. It's because they're trying to restrict highly funded programs from going after highly recruited athletes. So like I said this morning to our faculty, it's to keep Nick Saban out of your grandma's living room. It's not to make sure that no one's coming for cross country. There's an NCAA COVID FAQ that I would encourage you to look at just to get a sense of what's been done so far and what is still in the works. Right now, NCAA is still only addressing the class of 2020. They've made no provisions for the class of 2021. And they likely won't for a while, and their hand will likely be forced by these Power 5 conferences. So keep that in mind as well. Campus visits, I have not heard a single school that has said they're doing official visits or unofficial visits yet this fall. Again, we don't know what visitors are going to be allowed on campuses, and I don't know that it's going to be safe for your students to visit, even if it is encouraged. And so that's going to have to be a case-by-case basis. The other piece, and we talked about this a bit earlier, was the postponement and the cancellations of seasons. The implication there is going to be a change in positional needs, which I mentioned yesterday. So it might be, you know, finances aren't messed up, but they may have different positional needs for next season than they did when they started recruiting your kids, because now they have a whole class of kids staying that they didn't think were going to stay. And then the other piece, again, with the postponement and cancellation, is just paying attention to the schools that are recruiting your students and what's possible and what's not, because they're going to want your kid to come visit when they're in season, and now there are plenty of leagues that are no longer in season. So keep that piece in mind. It's funny, we actually cut half this presentation and it still went the whole time. So I'm going to stop sharing and go to chat real fast and see if we can't. I know it's 11:01. Do we want to hold these questions and just wait until the Q&A so that way we can have a 10-minute break? Is that good?
That's good.
We'll do that. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll come together at 11:10, and starting with the question session, we'll go back to some of these questions.
All right, so we're back now. We have just about an hour left, and we'd love to answer any of the additional questions you have. If there's topics we didn't get into over the last 2 days, certainly feel free to ask them now in the chat as well, and we'll do our best to address them. If we can get to them in this hour, we certainly will, and if not, we'll, as we've said several occasions, we will get back in our response, a written response post-conference. As Bev closed the last session saying, we'll address some of those NCAA and arts questions that we didn't quite get to because our presentation was robust and we were able to fill the hour slot without really any time for Q&A. So
We deleted so much too.
yeah, in person, it was about a 2-hour session last year.
Yeah.
And we pretty much did most of what we did last year too. And we'd love to be able to, obviously the three of us could talk about this stuff for a long, long time. We're passionate about it. And I think it becomes, it does change year to year. And so you do need to be aware of those changes as they come.
Absolutely. Yeah, one piece that I want to start with, there are a couple questions about the NCAA core courses. So truly, if you just Google NCAA core courses and it pops up some pieces from ncaa.org and just click on search for a high school's list of NCAA courses. It's the 4th option that pops up on Google for me. And you literally just type in your high school and it'll pop it up, or type in a different high school. So it'll give you state, city, high school name. And you can type that in and it'll show you every class that's approved. So that's what I do for my transfer students when they come in. That's a piece that for a lot of my students, we have a good number of transfers because we're in a bit of a unique position. And so often we don't get records until much later just because of the nature of summer and mayhem, and I've had kids enroll the first day of school via Post-it. So like everything's on the table. And so the second that we have a student who's a part of our admission process, which is different than most places, I make them send a report card just so I can get a sense of what classes they've already taken to make sure that we're not taking on a burden academically where we're going to have to overload this kid because they didn't take NCAA classes beforehand. So that core course website, again, just Google NCAA core courses and look for the one that says search for your high school's core courses, and you can do it for any high school.
The other piece of it too, somebody asked a question about how do you have your NCAA courses approved? There's an NCAA administrator site that at least, well, 2 members of your institution will officially be listed as the contacts for that. It's typically the director of college counseling, school counseling, whatever your titles are at your institution. For myself, it's myself and our associate head of school and dean of academics. Previously, it was myself and my associate director of college counseling. But that way, there's always 2 people that have access to the NCAA. We share the login with, everybody on campus who needs to have it. But it's something that you should check at the very least once a year to make sure your current courses are listed. All your courses are available. I try to make sure when we go through any course planning, I sit on the academic committee, and when we go through any course planning, my first point is always, I want this to be an NCAA approved course. I don't want to offer a course, even though we don't have a huge number of student athletes that go on to play college sports at St. Andrews. I don't want to have a student held back because they took courses that weren't NCAA approved. So with the exception of, and Beverly mentioned earlier, art courses and music, which tend to never really get approved as NCAA courses, almost all of our courses are NCAA approved. We're an Episcopal school. Our Introduction to Religious Studies course is a required course for all students. It's viewed as a history course by the NCAA because it is a survey of world religions. It's not just the Episcopal Church. That's an approved course for us. But again, it's because it's a survey. It was initially denied. We went back. We corrected we gave them the syllabus, and it was an approved course. So it's just something you need, like I said, at least once a year, log into your NCAA account, make sure your courses are listed. If you're no longer teaching the course, archive it so it's still available, and then your current courses are listed. That process could be one that we could spend a whole session on in itself. We don't need to, but if you do have questions about it, certainly ask them, and we'll follow up on that.
Yeah, and all of our contact information is available in the folder we'll send out. So if you have specific questions on how to do those pieces, you can certainly reach out to us. I often joke that with the NCAA, whenever they deny something, I just send them as many pieces of paper as I possibly can. So if you can over document anything, by all means do, and don't tell them I said that.
I was just going to add really quick, there will be things that happen to you on the high school side. I had a junior come to us, to the high school I was working at. He came from another New Orleans high school, so he sat out for a year, and then he came in senior year and all of a sudden was getting recruited, and sat in my office, decided he was interested. Well, his school did not have an eligibility center account, was not interested in creating one, was not going to do it. And there will be situations where there was no course overload that was going to fix that. There was nothing I could do. So just know that sometimes you will get put in weird situations, and they're going to happen. And sometimes, there's not necessarily a fix we can always do. Some of these are rules, some of these are, and it was a tough scenario, but it was also, one of those things that we assumed that New Orleans high schools were all private high schools were in the eligibility center portal. But know that sometimes you will enter some awkward situations like that. And it was a tough conversation.
I just put in the chat a quick link to the odds of playing college sports. The reality is, and that is for all divisions, Division 1, 2, and 3. So again, what I mentioned earlier, not everybody can play Division 3. Not everybody can play Division 2, and certainly not everybody can play Division 1. And so it's important that the students can be a superstar at your school, and they may not even be recruitable by any institution. I had a student athlete this year who is a great girls soccer player for us at St. Andrews. Wanted to play in college. Was admitted and was going to go to William and Mary, and she reached out to the soccer coach and said, I'd like to play. And in as nice a way as possible, the William and Mary soccer coach said, nope, not going to happen. We're already done, and you can't even walk on to our team. And she came into my office crying, and I don't deal with tears very well. I said, look, I shouldn't say her name. I said, look, it's a Division I institution. You were a star at our small little Episcopal school, and we won 3 games last year. You're not going to play at the college level. Now she actually ended up, she was walking on McAllister this fall. Of course, they're not going to play, but she's at least going to a place where she can play college soccer, and she can play at McAllister. She can be a Division III, but she was not going to be a Division I athlete. And in McAllister, she's actually going to play soccer and run track in the spring when they resume athletics. But I can't stress enough just being honest with students. And I always err on the it's not going to happen side versus, oh, it could happen. Because I'd rather be wrong and see them play someplace than be right and they have no chance of playing where they want to go. It's just, you just got to be honest with it. There's a great question that just came up, and I think we should all answer it as faculty members. What advice do you have for college counselors like us that are new to the field? Anything you wish you knew when you started? And since I read the question, I'm going to go first. The best advice and the thing I wish I knew is what we're doing right now. Go to conferences, network with people. I moved to the South 2 years ago. I was very active in New England within the New England ACAC, NEACAC, and SACAC welcomed me with open arms. SACAC is having experienced almost 18 years in New England. SACAC is, I can say, and if there's any other fellow New Englanders here, SACAC is the best ACAC in the country. And I know Bev's in PACAC now, but
not really.
yeah, SACAC it really is, takes people in and values your experience, and it's a great network. All of us as the faculty members for this summer served last summer on summer seminar. And you would think that the 6 of us have known each other forever. We met for the first time, all together for the first time, actually at the conference. And I call these other 5 people some of my best friends in the world now based off of what we did together last summer. The networking that you can do in this field is the most important, because if I have a question about financial aid or dealing with athletes or whatever else, it's making a quick phone call, sending a quick email or a text and saying, hey, Freddie, what's going on here? Like, what can I do? Or, and even at the other end of asking about an application, because then I don't feel like I'm intruding on him. We have a text chain, group text that we go back. I text these people as much as I text my siblings, which is a lot. I think that's doing what you're doing right now. And I know this has been difficult in a sense that it's all virtual. We would love to have you all in person, and hopefully we can someday soon. But this is the things you have to do. Get out there, get involved. I was lucky enough that in my first year or 2 in college admissions, my supervisor, my vice president, really pushed us to be involved in the ACAC, and that made a huge difference in the trajectory of my career.
Something I would like to share in terms of advice for the new college counselors would be that don't be afraid to try new things within your office. I've been serving in this college guidance office starting my 14th year here. And I've tried all sorts of stuff and made all sorts of mistakes. But I think, we play such a unique role in serving our students and families. We're not the ultimate decision makers, but we're the good middle group, the middle person for students and parents to go to. And if we are fearful of making changes that affects the decisions that our students and parents are making, then they can't have confidence and rely on us for good information. And so I would say try different things, ask a lot of questions, form little groups with the local counselors in the area, and create a team of your own to share ideas. You're not competing with another college guidance office, but you guys are in it to really help one another. And so that's been really helpful for me being in Orlando. We have a lot of different public, private schools in the area, and there's a consortium of high school counselors. We get together monthly and we share different ideas. We do professional development together, and we also organize a college fair, a national college fair for students. And that's been very helpful for me as I got my feet wet coming into the college guidance area. I had so many questions, and they were my support group to go to. And so, again, you can form a group of your own with the local counselors, or even reach out to us. You have all of our contact info. And like I mentioned before, like all of us are here to support you guys, to support one another. I contact Dan about SCORE, using SCORE all the time. He's my guru for that. I'll contact Bev for my quirky athletic situations I come across. But again, I think it's helpful to know that you guys have unlimited amount of resources out there, and everyone's willing to help one another.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm going to end up echoing Dan and Joyce, but When I started in college counseling, I was in Memphis, and so I was already in a community that I'd been a part of, and so I took for granted the community that I had, and the fact that SACAC was so welcoming and really encouraged me to be involved in so much. And now I'm in a situation where I don't really have a peer group, which is tough because, and I wish more people did the type of work that I do, because in some ways it's relevant to lots of different places. And when my students visit colleges, some coach will inevitably be like, and this will be your Bev. And I'm like, what does that person do? Like, I would love to know so I can have one. And so it's tough. So just know that especially this fall, as we're potentially looking at working virtually, it is even more important to feel like you have people. And so I'd encourage you not only to use us, but also to connect with each other. I think that's the one piece of summer seminar that I so loved last year, was watching the connections be formed between folks attending. And because you're not living and eating together, you don't necessarily get that opportunity, but I want to encourage you to take it, because you only get to be new once. And so be brave about asking questions. Don't ever worry about that. Milk being new for as long as you can. And then the other piece is just to make sure that you become comfortable having tough conversations, because where the rubber meets the road, if you are nothing but encouraging and you're not realistic, at the end of the road, there's a point at which it could feel like, even though it's not, it can feel like it's your fault or it's your responsibility when it's not. And so I found that it is a lot easier to have tough conversations at the beginning than it is to make up a tough conversation at the end, because things didn't go the way a student anticipated. And so that's why I always make sure that everything's documented by email. I make sure that I'm as clear as possible with everybody. And it also means that students trust me, right? So when I say something honest, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be discouraging. I'm trying to make sure they know what's going on. And I think students appreciate that. John, we can't hear you. Unplug it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, his technical difficulties have been.
This is the first time I've talked today, so it's kind of funny. But for me, I would definitely say two pieces of major advice for you. Number one, Jab, is understanding having a good work-life balance for yourself is really important, and understanding to work and how to work, but also knowing when it's time to say, I don't need to work anymore, and have time for your friends or your family, just for yourself to kind of recharge your batteries and re-energize yourself as well. This is the kind of job that it can encompass your entire life in some parts of the year, and knowing that how you gain your energy and how you gain that spark for yourself will be really important to kind of make sure you have that as you move along the way. And number two is understanding and knowing your role in the overall community of your school. I know we're talking specifically about college counseling right now, but in a lot of school settings, you'll be wearing more than just that one hat, and understand the power in the yes and the no that you have. Number one, your priority a lot of times will be doing this job, but there'll be other things along the way, and helping people understand your priorities and how you want to make sure that you do your first job and your priority to its best for your students. And the other things may have to become secondary, and helping the administration understand that as well. Just so understanding your role in your community, I think is really important, and that power of saying yes and no to the right things and the wrong things for you as you go and develop in your school is important as well. But yeah, that's it for me.
I'm going to jump in because I'm going to make Freddie go last. Because I feel like he's going to have the most poignant things to say, right, Freddie? So the main thing I'd say is my personal fear is I'm very type A. I'm very research oriented. If you ask my fiance, he's like, can you just make a decision? Like, we don't need to research 14 more styles of a TV. Like, it'll be fine. But when I went over to the college counseling side, I am hyper nervous about not having the right answer. And it's very scary to feel like you don't. But at the best part of our job, we're giving the best advice we can. And knowing that if you're type A like me and you're very scared of being wrong, I'll go ahead, you'll be wrong. I've been wrong. We'll all be wrong. And it took me a long time of talking to people like Dan and Bev and John and Joyce that, like, it's okay. We're going to go out there and give really good advice and really well-founded advice and really positive advice, but sometimes we'll be proven wrong. Things will change. We're in an ever-changing profession. And so your list of notes, 12 pages long about specifically detailing how to go through this program at this school, the next year they're going to rewrite that policy. It's just the inevitable way that things change. So these people are absolutely amazing. John has actually known me since I was a freshman in college and a tour guide. So there's some scary fun facts for you. Bev was one of my first college visits out on the road. And I got one of her awesome swimmers my first year, and we texted 24/7, like, please, Will, choose my school. Joyce and Dan, I both got to meet at summer seminar last year. Joyce is my outfit twin. We dress alike, and she gets very upset when we don't. And I accidentally dress like someone else. Dan, no one makes an impact like getting a bear hug from Dan Monahan in a room full of like Jesuit networked people that are like, how in the world did they know each other? And Freddie, my little Freddie that I text for all my intel and road warrior tips and to keep me pumped up and going through the travel season. I couldn't think of a more better and positive person to have in my world. So these people are great. It's been a great part to be a part of all this, and I hope you'll continue to stay in touch and be around us. And if you ever need somebody to tell you it's okay to be wrong, I'll tell you. It was a hard learned lesson, but it's all okay.
I mean, to sum up what everybody said, I mean, it's one word, it's the community. And find your community. I've never been on your side of the desk, but I typically on my side of the desk, I travel between 150 to 200 days out of the year. Local, international, and out-of-state travel. So it gets lonely on the road. And it's funny, I mean, Dan mentioned we have a group text, but if you see our group text messages, nothing deals with work. It's all about the personal side. It's all about uplifting. It's all about helping each other out. And I always go back to, we do the small things that make a big difference. I know there's been a lot of talk about school counselors, IECs, guidance counselors, whatever the branch is. The truth of the matter is none of us are counselors. All of you, and this is what I've seen from my side of the desk, your moms and your dads. You're so much more than a counselor to students. You're there for their ups, their downs, their games. I've seen so many counselors invite their even own children, hey, come over to my house, let's have dinner, because they see they're not being nourished well. You become their second parent, you become their psychologist. You are so much more than just what our titles deem it to be. So find your community. And I'll just give you the best example, right? John, I mean, when we had our Marjorie Stoneman Douglas tragedy, I was probably at a school maybe, a week later, 10 days later, he had cookies ready for me. And we sat down and we talked about how I was dealing with it. And those are the small things that make a big difference. So find your community. And again, and I'll reiterate once more, none of us are counselors. We are so much more than that. We're parents, we're moms, and we're dads to these students that, you know what? Think of it this way. On a Monday through Friday, they're at school about 35 to 40 hours a week. Let's say they sleep 8 hours a day. They probably see their biological mother and father maybe 2 or 3 hours every day. You make so much more of a stronger impact than what you know. And when I read essays, letters of recommendation, these students come back and say, you know what? This person impacted my life. They gave me this advice. Unfortunately, sometimes we're in the profession that we don't always get all the most positive news, but I can tell you, you make such a crucial impact on the students' lives. And from the college side, just thank you for what y'all do. I know that sometimes it comes not acknowledged. And I think on the college side, we have to do a better communication plan to that. But just thank you for everything that you do. And again, being the second parent to a lot of these children.
One question I saw in the chat that I want to make sure we get to address, especially because Dan and I have somewhat unique roles. Someone asked about what's happening in the fall in terms of plans. Dan and I are both the COVID coordinators, COVID planners. Never thought that was a hat I would get to add for our school. So obviously I'm in a bit of a different boat because I'm up in Philly. And so we're obviously dictated by what by what the county, what the state says. I'm also in an interesting situation because where my boys train and where they go to school are technically next to each other, but there's a road in between that they cross every day, and that road is County Line Road. So where they train and where they go to school are actually in 2 different counties. And then I also have another, I know, Kate's expression is like my whole life. And then we also have a campus at the stadium, which is in a third county. So we're governed by 3 different counties. We're also governed by the MLS and the USL, which is the second team league in terms of what we're allowed to do. So all of that is to say that we have a lot of things to consider. So our back to school plan looks like this. We're going to have a week of back to school individually scheduled opportunities for new families so that they can come in and meet teachers mask to mask, but not interact with other families, and also not put a ton of kids in the building. So that will happen over the course of a week, when that would usually be like a back to school breakfast where everybody would just shove in and eat donuts. We're gonna have to be really deliberate about that. So that's spread out over the course of the week. The next 2 weeks are gonna be fully 100% virtual. That's what we call phase 1. And that's so that if we have a student or a faculty or a community member that is positive at some point, we know what phase 1 looks like when we have to revert back to it. So we'll do that for 2 weeks. That gets us to Labor Day. And that's when we do our first assessment of, do we stay in phase 1 or do we go to phase 2, which is a hybrid model where we either do 2 clean 2, so 2 days with older boys, clean on Wednesday, and then 2 days with younger boys. And when they're not physically at school, they're virtual. Or we'll do an AM clean PM, which means that older boys go to school in the morning, we clean at lunch, and then we have school in the afternoon for younger students. Part of our challenge is that our students train twice a day. So we have to be super mindful of when they train, where they train, all of those pieces. We also don't have a school nurse because we have an entire training staff and team doctors. So they're the ones who are responsible for doing things like temperature checks in the morning and being mindful of contact tracing, but we still have to be aware of those things as well. So that's where we are right now. If I can be candid, I have a feeling we're going to be virtual more than we're not, because our second team league just released a decision that no players are allowed to attend in-person school. And given the option, our students would choose soccer over school every day of the week, which is why we exist, so they don't have to make that choice. So I think we'll have to offer a year-long virtual option, even if we end up being in person, so that those students can still play.
We have a similar plan. Our boarding students are coming back early to then modify quarantine within our residence halls. We're going to test regularly. We're partnering with Sewanee to do our testing. We'll test the entire student body and faculty and staff to start the year to give us a baseline. And then we're going to test in 4 groups throughout the year, and random selection of those groups. Our residential faculty, our day faculty and staff, our boarding students, and our day students. And so we'll test weekly, a random subset of each of those groups, each of those 4 groups each week, and hope that we won't have positive cases. But the reality is we're lucky in that one of our graduates, class of '96, works with the CDC. And he's been my bro this summer. We've talked a lot, and we're pretty much following CDC guidelines as far as what we're doing, which is good, because we have boarding students from all over the country and world, and then we have day students from kind of all over Middle Tennessee as well, with students as far as Chattanooga area where Ann is, and others that are in the Chattanooga area too. But we have to keep in mind where we have our kids coming from. It's going to be a challenging year, and like Bev, I think we're going to probably be more online than in person than we want to admit. For those of you that may be in boarding schools, we're going to singles only. So and keeping our dorms smaller in person to try to treat them as family units. My wife and I and our family live in a dorm. We typically have 12 students living with us. Next year we'll only have 6. And we're, I guess, lucky in that we can offer singles to all of our students, but it's also spreading out our residential faculty a little bit more than we typically do over campus. But things that we're have to hopefully roll with the punches and hope a vaccine is available, readily available by January, February, and everybody can take it and kind of go from there.
The other piece real quickly, we're not using lockers this year. And I've heard that from several schools. So no lockers this year. It's just a lot easier not to deal with it, with the cross-contamination. If you have students who share lockers, we don't, but it's still, and their lockers are awful anyway. So it's just easier to have them carry their little locker around them on their back than to deal with the alternative. The other piece is that the way it works for us, at least in Pennsylvania, is that students have to wear masks when they're in school unless they're seated 6 feet apart. And so in a lot of ways, this is giving me a bit of a flashback to doing SAT and ACT test like organization, figuring out where kids go, because when you're a test coordinator for those tests, you have to start measuring desks and putting tables apart by a certain amount. So now you just have to add 2 feet to every single one of those that you do. But it's super helpful because if they're seated 6 feet apart, then they don't have to have masks on, but the faculty members still do. The other piece, and I'm really grateful that I work someplace that's so aware of this, but we're very mindful that faculty aren't able to do everything, right? And we'll have some faculty who will say, I don't feel comfortable coming back to teach in any way. And then we'll have some faculty who will say, even when we're 100% virtual, if I teach from home anymore, I'm going to lose my mind. So we want to make sure that we're flexible with everyone. So if teachers want to teach in the building while we're virtual, we would love them to. But we also know that we've got 2 faculty already who, because of their children's circumstances, are going to have to teach from home virtually, and that's okay too. So we're having to be as flexible as possible. And that's where we've created an environment where teachers feel comfortable asking, which I think has been really huge. All right. I'm still going through questions to see what else. We've got lots of good book recommendations in here, by the way. For the record, and I haven't seen it mentioned here, but and this is me shilling in a very biased way, but if you haven't read The Colleges That Change Lives, I would highly encourage you to. They are certainly not the only colleges that change lives by any means, but it is an excellent grouping of schools. They tour together as a group, probably not this fall, but at some point in the future. They've done some virtual fairs and engagements already, but they're small private liberal arts colleges around the country that churn out more CEOs and college presidents than the Ivies, but that accept students that are not your exceptional straight A students. I went to a CTCL school. I worked for a CTCL school. My sister went to a CTCL school. My other sister worked at one. John and Kate both worked at, Kate went to a CTCL school. I mean, we're all in it. So I would highly encourage you to look at Colleges That Change Lives. There's 2 versions of the book. The first is by Lauren Pope. And the second, I can't remember who wrote it, but it's a revised version that moves some schools out and put some schools in. Just get both. I prefer the old copy, but that's because I'm old. Let's see.
I had a funny Colleges That Change Lives story. I had a student a couple years ago. She just graduated from Rhodes this past May. She applied to more schools than I really want to admit, but she applied to 15 schools, and they all happen to be Colleges That Change Lives schools. I'm like, that's great. You're using the Colleges That Change Lives as your foundation. She's like, what is that? But so she's a graduate of Rhodes now. She's has a she's in Spain now for the year, which is great. With her, she already got into Spain with COVID and everything else, and she's studying graduate study in Spain now.
That's awesome. The other resource that I think is really helpful that I had no concept of when I was an admissions counselor, but I found really helpful, and you're going to have to go probably on Amazon or somewhere to find this because they don't really produce it anymore physically, but it's the Ruggs Guide, RUGG''S. I really prefer it because it divides, you can use, you can't use US News and World Report, but you can use lots of other things, and we would be happy for you to do that. But what I love about the Ruggs Guide is that it is sorted by major, right? And then within that, it's either identified by how selective the school is or the size. There are lots of different measures in there, but it's just I still have a physical copy in my apartment because, and I don't even know that I use it that much, but it's so useful to figure out when you've got a kid like this year who said, I want to study astrophysics, to be able to go into the physics section, find actual astrophysics and say, this is every school in the country that offers it. It was just so useful. So if you have the option to access a rugs guide. I know it's available online now, but I would highly encourage you to look for it because I found it essential and I'd never heard of it until I started in this profession.
I second rugs. I use rugs every year, especially for those off the wall kind of oddball majors that like, how do you're 17, what, but you can pull out the rugs guide and it is all online. I print mine off, I put it in a 3-ring binder, and you can go through all the majors that way. And one of the great things is that, some of those off the wall oddball majors, as I mentioned, they're going to fill a page, maybe half a page. And then business, as an example, fills 8 pages in rugs recs. So it can help you illustrate to students how choice of the major can sometimes influence their admissibility to a given institution or limit their college options. When you have 8 pages of business programs and a half a page of astrophysics, well, there's your search list. Same thing with psychology versus business or with business. Something that's come up a couple times is the terminology, guidance and school counselor, college counselor. I'll first state that nobody's meant any offense here. There are terms that are used sometimes interchangeably. I'm a college counselor. I'm lucky in that that's all I do. My 9 to 5, my 5 to 9, my 9 to 5 is college counseling. We have a school counselor on campus that she deals with the mental health aspects of things. When they start crying, I send her to Dr. Garner. I deal with college counseling. I'm kidding. I do let them cry in my office. So I'm a college counselor. Some of us are school counselors. There are still some offices that use the term guidance, and I realize that guidance can be offensive to some people. We are shifting as a nation to everybody being school counselors or college counselors. So I just realized that I think some offices are a little different. So nobody has meant any offense. I'll just put that out there. We all know we're all in this together, and that's. I guess that's what I'll say about that. I'm looking at chats, questions. It was mentioned yesterday that the access to the recordings and the are going to be available on the SACAC website. In order to access them, you do need to be a SACAC member. We'll send out to all participants materials from the past 2 days, but the videos, if you want to go back to them, they're going to be password protected on the SACAC page, and so you'll have to be a SACAC member to access them. SACAC membership is really a great thing, so hopefully your institution supports it. If your institution doesn't support it, it's minimal cost, especially on the secondary side. For an individual membership. So definitely, if you're not already a SACAC member, I encourage you to become one. As I've mentioned, I've been heavily involved in NEACAC and SACAC and obviously at the national level with NACAC. SACAC's great. It's just because you have so many different states involved and all sorts of different types of institutions, it really is a beneficial membership.
And Dan, can I quickly mention, in the talk of CEU credits, there will be a follow-up survey sent out to all participants that we'd like to have you fill out. Just give us feedback from the event. And along with that, we'll gain information that we can send you to kind of help you get your credits as well. So look for that coming up in the following days.
Anne asked a good question about how to make resources available to students if we're not able to be in person in the fall. I maintain both a Google site and then we use Canvas as our SIS. And so or our learning management system rather, excuse me. And so I keep a class on each site so that way families have access to anything and everything that they would have access to if they were physically in my office. I had to do that long before COVID because I'm in an environment where most of my students are not from nearby. And even the ones that are, their family, really, we were so close to being done. Sorry. My cat's very active. anyway, even my students who are from close by, their families work. So there's just no way for them to be able to be for families to be physically in my office going through something. So everything that I do, I record, I do lots of screencasts. To Joyce's point about doing stuff and failing a bunch, Kate's as well. My first year, I did a ton of programs and nobody ever came, and it was just really sad. And I felt very silly about it. And then I realized it's because they're just not timed correctly. So I'm grateful to have been able to screencast things and to use Zoom before it was in vogue. But I would highly encourage you, if you're able to create a Google site, or if you can create a class in your school's learning management system, I think that would be very helpful. Charlotte thinks so as well.
Jareen, go ahead and ask your question if you want.
I need to run to the next Zoom meeting, as sure a lot of us do. Just real quickly, I'm really excited to be in SACAC. I am a relic. I've been around a long time, and I've done residence life and academic advising, mostly admissions for quite some time. I'm super excited to see Loyola here. Just a quick tidbit. I was one of those students that probably on site would have been denied, and Loyola took a chance on me, and I was able to get 1 to 2 degrees, not 1 degree, but 2. So really evaluate the students thoroughly, because definitely I would have been looked over. And secondly, there was some talk about, not taking a reference from an IEC. Sometimes I spend 4-6 hours a week with one student. So maybe not all IECs are thorough. I can't say that, but some of us really spend a lot of time with parents, with students, with their school counselors. So don't dismiss what is in the recommendation or what we have to say just because we are not on site, because sometimes they will tell us things they're not telling anybody else because we are the outside person. So anyway, you all have a great and blessed day, and I'm going to go to my next webinar, like I'm sure all of you are too. Have a great day.
I'm looking through, we've got a little bit less than 10 minutes. So I'm just going through the chat to see if there are any others that we can do. There are some questions about chat questions being available. I am screenshotting, you might hear it when my microphone's on. I'm screenshotting everything, and then Kate and I are transcribing it in a Google Doc. So we have every question that you've asked, and then we're including answers to every question, even if we verbally answered it in this conversation, just in case you missed any part of it. My cat is now moving my computer, I'm sorry. So yeah, so you will have access to all of those things in the resources. All right. See some roads love from Kiva Dackett, thank you. All right, let's see. A couple of questions from our initial conversation about about helping students understand where they fall as a student athlete. I feel like I've talked a lot, Dan, if you want to hop into this one. You included a link that I think is really useful.
Again, I think it's, they have to consider their space and place. To be a superstar at a place like St. Andrews Sewanee is very different than to be a superstar at a place like Cheshire Academy, and then how that translates to the next level. When you have students who, the best of the best are going to get noticed. It doesn't matter where they play, whether you're a tiny school or a huge public school, whether you're like me on a rural mountaintop in Tennessee or in Chicago where I grew up. The players are going to get noticed, and I know everybody hears about the diamond in the rough, and they're going to be found, especially now. My oldest brother played football at Northern Illinois. When he played at Northern Illinois, the entire roster was made up of players from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. And now, when you look at Northern Illinois' roster, it is players from Hawaii and California and Texas and Florida and Maine and everywhere in between. Division I, II, and III is now a coast-to-coast and international recruitment effort. Somebody asked about international recruitment. It's a little different for international students from NCAA eligibility perspective, especially if they're a transfer. It's a lot easier if they come in directly from abroad, but they can certainly go. I've had several international students that have played at the college level as a transfer, or if they withdrew all 4 years. But those kids are going to get recognized, and then the recruitment is going to filter out where they belong. They may get letters from the Big Ten, but they're going to get recruited by the MAC, or they may get letters from the MAC, but they're going to be recruited by the Patriot League, or and on it goes. They're going to have their hopes and dreams, and sometimes you may have to crush them, but they're going to end up where they should end up, and they're going to make that choice too. Again, like my kid Danny, who's playing baseball at Northeastern, not playing baseball at Northeastern. He would have been a superstar here at Sewanee, where he was going to go, and would have been an All-American here. But he chose to have that D1 or bust mentality to get a roster spot. He got a roster spot. There's been talk of other revenue sports versus non-revenue sports, the myth of the college scholarship. Even with FBS football, they're not all necessarily full scholarships either. The Power 5 conferences they are, but outside of the Power 5, they're not necessarily full scholarships either. So the problem that we're running into now is so many students have specialized and they're only playing one sport. Obviously, BEV students are a little different, and that's their path. But the best option for them is to play multiple sports, to do multiple things, to be well-rounded student athletes, so they're not putting all their eggs in the football basket or the basketball basket or the volleyball basket. That there's going to be a school that's going to fit for them. A lot of us in this conference, we're student athletes, both high school and college. I played 3 sports in high school. I'll leave you with this mental image. I played football, I wrestled, and I played water polo. So while you haven't met me in person, you can just vision me in a Speedo, and we'll leave it at that.
Or not, whichever. One thing I will say from my students, and I think that they can be a good gauge. My students, like I said, 15% of them play soccer professionally, if not in this country, then abroad. And the rest are Division I athletes. And even then, I can name on 2 hands the number of kids I've worked with who received full athletic rides. Soccer only has 9.9 scholarships in Division I to spread amongst what can be a 33-person roster. And so oftentimes students are getting packages that are more need-based than anything else. That's why it's important to fill out the FAFSA. But my students, I would say, are fairly well funded, again, because they are elite athletes. And if they're not pros, they're very close. And even then, most of them are not receiving full athletic rides. So to squash that idea of the full scholarship, the only students that I have that are truly on full scholarships are ones that probably left after the first season to sign a professional contract. Or I have a couple of students who are undocumented, so not DACA, but undocumented. And so they received full athletic scholarships because they weren't able to apply for other forms of aid. And so every student is different, and certainly every circumstance is different, but know that those full scholarships are elusive. And even the top of the top, my kids who are incredible athletes, I have students who play for the senior men's national team, and they still did not receive full rides. So just something to keep in mind. All right, and we're at 11:59, y'all, or 10:59 if you're Kate. Yeah. I'm gonna mute so you don't have to keep listening to Charlotte.
All right, everyone. I think we could all say that we've definitely enjoyed spending time with you this morning and sharing some great information with you. Just definitely want to thank all the great faculty members, Joyce, Dan, Kate, Freddie, Bev. You all did a wonderful job, and just thank you so much for all you've done once again, there'll be information that'll be coming out as a follow-up for you all. So please look for that in your email box very, very soon. Joyce, do you have anything else to say before we let everybody go?
No, just a reminder that we will share all of our presentations and whatnot. We also have a document that has lists of various resources that you guys will find very helpful. This is something we share with all summer seminar participants year after year. We would also recommend doing this again next year, you know, with hopes and prayers that we'll be back in person doing this on a college campus for 4 days together. It makes a world of difference in connecting with one another, and it's we do more sessions in person, and so hopefully things will change. We're just very thankful that you guys joined us during this crazy time. And so, yeah, feel free to reach out to individual. We have all of our contact info in the slides that we will share. And so don't hesitate to reach out to us.
So,
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, guys.